Thank you all for being here this evening and taking your precious time out to listen to the story of the book that I recently published. It was published in India last year and published in Britain just a few months ago. I'm also very thankful to the Times Literature Festival for inviting me. I've often been asked why I wrote this book. And there are two primary reasons. The first is the annexation of Surat. A lot has been written about how the English East India Company annexed Awadh. The fall of Delhi has been iconized by William Dalrymple's book, The Last Mughal. Innumerable accounts of the iconic clash between Tipu Sultan and Richard Wellesley. But nothing on how Surat, which was Mughal India's greatest port, fell to the English East India Company. And I thought that was an acutely important part of history that was untapped. The second reason was the story of the young prince of Surat, who at the age of 26 decided to challenge the empire on their home soil. I found that story utterly riveting. It was the story of this young man who lands up in Britain to plant his case in the Houses of Parliament, which had actually been unprecedented, and his life in Britain, what actually happened to him. It was an incredible legacy that this young prince left back in Britain, but as time is ruthless, it faded away. But when I read the minutes of what actually transpired in the Houses of Parliament, I was hooked, and I had to tell the story. But before we get to this 26-year-old Indian prince in Britain, I think it's important that we understand what Surat was as a port, and how it fell to the English East India Company. So Surat was Mughal India's greatest port. Between the late 1600s and right up till 1799, Ruby Maloney, who is the expert on the history of Surat, calls it the greatest port that India had ever seen. And the reason for this incredible port was because of its fabulous geographic location. Situated on the banks of the river Tapti, this imposing castle bore testimony to India's might in maritime trade. It produced an eclectic mix of merchants, fabulous mix, Chalabi Turks, Jews, Armenians, Hindus, Jains, Muslim, Bohras, Arabs, all of them, in this melting pot of a city. And the trade was the utmost in Surat. You could have trade happening in bullion, in spices, in cotton, and it was truly, as Thomas Roe put it, the fountain of all East India trade. Now, in this thriving mix, the English East India Company made a rather humble entry. If you look at their entry in Surat, that is the first factory that they set up in 1608. It was a very humble beginning. It was a license that they got to trade because Emperor Jahangir was convinced by Thomas Roe. And it was a small little factory for refining cotton for the demand in the Far East. But as time went by and the Mughal Empire began to fade, with the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, by that time, between 1608 and 1707, the English East India Company had grown in stature. Not just had they spread their tentacles across India, but they also had their own relatively fledgling army in the early 1600s. But by the mid-1700s, it was 300,000 strong. And it was this incredible corporation that was spreading its tentacles all across India. I won't get into how the East India Company came to annex large chunks of India, because that's a completely different story. I'll stick to Surat. The English made Surat their home. It was a very glamorous city, and when you visit Surat today, you probably wouldn't think of it that way, but it was a cosmopolitan, buzzing, heaving city with Portuguese and English traders, the Dutch were there, and of course the Indian merchants. So the English made this their home. They lived and died in Surat, and a large number of them built these fantastic cemeteries. And if none of you have been to Surat, or even if you have and you haven't had the opportunity to visit these cemeteries, I urge you to do so. It's an incredible mix of Indo-Saracenic and European architecture in relatively good condition. And so anyways, the English made this their home. They lived and died there, and it was their, it was their crown in their trading activities. Surat, though, continued to be ruled by the Nawabs. Now, these were men who had declared independence in 1733, particularly after the decline of the Mughal court in Delhi. They were great patrons of art, literature, terrific buildings, huge patrons of Surat textile. In fact, just yesterday I was told that they sent 3 Parsi fishermen to China to study textile. And apparently the Tanchoki saris that we are kind of aware of now are because these 3 fishermen came back equipped with Chinese textile making skills, and that propelled Surat even further. The hereditary line of the Nawabship of Surat continued to flourish, but by the late 1700s, one man landed in India. His name was Richard Wellesley. And it's very important to understand the narrative that this man comes to India with. He completely redefines the attitude of the East India Company. As a trading company, it no longer champions that narrative. Richard Wellesley comes into India with eye on conquest. He's completely distraught at Britain having lost the Americas. And for him, the plains of India provide the ideal testing ground for empire expansion. He locks his horns with the directors in the East India Company and convinces them that it's all about conquering India and not trading in India. And he has this unquenchable thirst to capture forts and palaces. And he prides himself in being this landed estate gentry of Britain who's landed up in India to make a fortune. Of course, he's helped by his rather able brother, Arthur Wellesley, who in due time would go on to become the Duke of Wellington. But the thirst for conquest in Richard Wellesley doesn't die. He goes and pitches tent in Mysore, defeats Tipu, wages wars against the Marathas, and so on and so forth. This would bring him in head-to-head confrontation with Nawab Nasiruddin. Now, Nawab Nasiruddin was an able ruler, relatively aging, but the context of Surat at that time in terms of military power was marginal. The Nawabs of Surat hardly had any army. They actually did not. They just had corps that would patrol the cities, maintain law and order. And Richard Wellesley knew that well. So in March 1800, Richard Wellesley sends in his battalions and arm twists the Nawab into signing away his administrative powers. There's no way that Nawab Nasiruddin could resist the man who had defeated Tipu Sultan. It was a non-starter. And so rather reluctantly, with great sorrow in his eyes, the Nawab signs away his ruling powers to Richard Wellesley. Now, it's important to note that this is under the threat of forceful invasion of Surat. If the Nawab doesn't sign, Surat will be invaded, and that's pretty much what Richard Wellesley threatens. The Treaty of 1800 is important to understand because I'm not going to go into great details, but this is what the treaty this is the treaty that was signed. The Nawab would be allowed to keep his personal estates. Now, the personal estates of the Nawab were close to a third of Surat. He would be paid an annual amount of £15,000 and a plethora of finer points that, to justify the annexation, the East India Company say, listen, we'll support this from generation to generation. This is going to be for good. The family will be looked after. and this is going to be for perpetuity. So these were the words that were given in assurance to the Nawab family in the Treaty of 1800. Reluctantly, the treaty is signed, and Nawab Nasiruddin, loses himself to poetry. That's all that he can do. Nasiruddin dies and is succeeded by this gentleman called Nawab Afzaluddin. Now, as you can see, from his arched eyebrows and drooping eyelids, he's a man of leisure and pleasure, born into a time where he doesn't have the duties of actually ruling and administering Surat. He's given to all kinds of pleasures. He's an opium addict. He's addicted to all kinds of intoxicating drugs. But at the same time, he's a relatively shrewd man as well. And that we will see in a bit. So Afzaluddin knows that he doesn't have to rule Surat, but he's been guaranteed for life and for generation to generation his income and his estates. It's important to understand, what these estates are. And I'll come to that in a bit. These included 4 majestic palaces: the Mehmudi Palace, Aina Mahal, and Darya Mahal. The Aina Mahal was a palace of 1,000 mirrors, and you can well imagine the lavishness of that palace. Besides that, there were an extraordinary amount of gardens, 7 in total, each acre upon acre of the finest fruits and majestic gardens. The Nagina Bagh had this extraordinary lagoon in the middle of it with little boats. And all of these were on the bank of the river Tapti, and you can imagine how glorious they must have been. The Afzal Bagh, unfortunately, cuts out in the end, was an orchard full of pomegranates. The Dilfiza Bagh, which actually means the heart that warms me, was an extraordinary garden of jasmine and all kinds of wonderful plantations. These estates were not just the personal property of the Nawab, but they also provided employment to the local public. Gardeners, stable boys, weavers, potters, craftsmen. A third of Surat was employed by these estates. And I think that's very important to understand as well. Sorry. Bear with me a second. So Afzaluddin, as we've seen, is a rather unique character. He's given to leisure and pleasure. But there's a lurking fear in him. And the lurking fear is because he has only one surviving child, and that's a daughter. And she's rather sickly. And he is afraid that the East India Company, as it has done in the past, and its track record has shown, it's violated treaties dramatically. The doctrine of lapse has not yet kicked in, which was basically a law that the East India Company passes later on in 1848, where if a ruler does not have a male heir or a son, the annexation would happen by the East India Company, and we're all aware of what the Rani of Jhansi did. She fought for her rights, etc., etc. But at this time, in the early 1830s, there is no doctrine of lapse. But Afzaluddin has this lurking fear that after his death, if his sickly daughter doesn't survive, who's suffering from galloping tuberculosis, what would happen to these incredible estates? So the search begins to find a male heir. And Afzaluddin looks everywhere. He first calls for the Mughal princes from a decaying court in Delhi. Mirza Humayun and Mirza Najaf are two rather decadent Mughal princes who make their way to Surat. And Afzaluddin has great hopes of these two wonderful princes. But one of them is found in an opium den, and the other one is found in a brothel. And Afzaluddin sees the reflections of his own personality in these two princes and sends them packing. But this incredible search continues. Finally, after much searching, Afzaluddin identifies a tiny little principality. It's in what what was termed back then the Badlands of India, Kathiawar, Gujarat. It's a small little principality called Kamandya. And the ruler of that principality is a 16-year-old young prince. He's created quite a stir in that region of Gujarat, because that region of Gujarat was infested with bandits, lawlessness. The worst of the lot was were the Makranis, who had descended into Gujarat from Balochistan. They were wreaking havoc. And this young man had gone and fought battles with them, fought battles with the local chiefs, helped in bringing relative stability. And so the murmurings of this young man reach Afzaluddin's ear. And he immediately sends a proposal for this young man to marry his daughter. This gentleman is Mir Jafar Ali Khan. He is the ruler of this tiny principality of Kamandia. Not only is he officially adopted by Afzaluddin, the Nawab of Surat, and it's an official adoption, he's also married off to his younger daughter, his only daughter. And it's a clearly thought out strategy by Afzaluddin. He believes that the English have had a massive track record of betrayals. And so if they don't recognize the daughter, they'll have to recognize his adopted son. If they don't recognize his adopted son, they'll have to recognize the daughter. And thinking that he's secured his family and secured the estates, he's quite a content man. Now, this young couple, Mir Jafar Ali Khan and his wife, lead a peaceful life in Surat. But as fate would have it, they too don't have any sons. They just have two young girls. And as we will learn in the story, as the story progresses, we will realize how ridiculously nonchalant the English East India Company was when it came to Indian princes and their own royal family, whereby they could accept Victoria as a queen, but they would not accept women as successors to the states here. Nevertheless, life carries on till finally in 1842, Afzaluddin is found dead in his opium den. Quite appropriately, I would think. But at this point in time, immediately, catastrophe descends on the family. The English East India Company storm into the palaces and announce that the Nawab of Surat title is now made extinct. And that's what it actually is. Even today, the Nawab of Surat title is extinct. It does not exist. Besides that, they stop the annual income of the family, and they usurp every house, every orchard, every palace, turn out the staff. Every craftsman is told to pack his bag and leave. Every textile producer is told to pack his bags and leave. Every gardener is thrown out of the garden. And the young family of the Nawab of Surat is left to live a life in a miserable one-bedroom apartment. Things are rather terrible for the family at this time. And it is under these circumstances that the treaty stands completely violated. With the pension stopped, with the estate seized, the situation for the two young granddaughters of the last Nawab is utterly bleak. It's evidently clear that the East India Company want to leave them on the brink of destitution. Now, it's under these circumstances that Mir Jafar Ali Khan, who was the adopted son, the ruler of Kamandia, as well as the husband of the sickly daughter of the last Nawab, decides to challenge the canon of empire expansion. And he does a rather interesting thing. He doesn't challenge the East India Company in India. He voyages straight to Britain in 1844, something which had not necessarily happened very often, and he parks himself in the Mewards, or what is currently known as the Claridges on Brook Street. Where does he get the money to do this? Because the money is stopped by the East India Company. His father is a relatively cash-rich ruler of Kamandia, and he funds his trip to Britain to fight for his daughter's causes. When he arrives in Britain, he realizes that the English East India Company is not necessarily the most popular in Britain. It has its shares of critics. And he starts breaking into the upper echelons of British society. Not only does he start getting a bit of traction there, the press in Britain go absolutely, crazy about him, and there are an innumerable amount of articles written about his presence, about his attire, about his robes, about his turbans. He attends operas, all in this incredible PR move to try and expose the English East India Company's malpractices to the English at home. While he starts getting a bit of traction, there's also a certain sense of apprehension, because he's probably one of the first princes to land up in Britain and say, listen, this is what your colonizing corporation is doing in India. Give me a patient hearing, and I want to put my case across in the courts in Britain. But while he's doing this, he's stirring and he's ruffling a lot of feathers in the upper echelons of British society. And word reaches the movers and shakers of the English East India Company. He has a meeting with the chairman of the English East India Company. That's the headquarters of the English East India Company as it stood in Victorian England. And while the chairman of the English East India Company thinks that the injustice is utterly flagrant, the deputy chairman rules out any possibility of any compensation because they believe this would set a precedence for Indians coming and fighting their cases in Britain. And this goes to show how deeply divided Britain itself was. You have the chairman of the company saying, this is injustice, it cannot go unpunished, and the deputy chairman, along with the board of directors, voting against the chairman. Time is running out, and obviously the funds are relatively limited to keep him going in Britain. And he very quickly, Mir Jafar Ali Khan realizes that he's running out of funds to keep himself going there. Nevertheless, there would be one event that would change things quite dramatically for him. And that would be an event which was the lodestar social event of the English calendar, the Royal Ascot. Just when things are looking rather dim and rather bleak, one of the MPs who Mir Jafar Ali Khan befriends tells him that, listen, I'll get you a box in the Royal Ascot, at the Royal Ascot, and this box is relatively close to another box which is going to be inhabited by a relatively powerful couple. And that couple happens to be Victoria and Albert. Now, by this time, Victoria has developed a real affection for India. She wants to know more about this exotic land. She isn't empress as yet, but she wants to learn more. She has this thirst for India. And any kind of, correspondence from India is something that she greets with great warmth. So while there's a break in the Royal Ascot, her eyes fall on Mir Jafar Ali Khan. Now, it's documented that she gazed at him for close to a minute. She couldn't get her eyes off this 26-year-old prince dressed in these incredible Indian robes. And she nudged Albert for an introduction. And as they're all lined up for an introduction to the Queen, Mir Jafar Ali Khan is prompted to put his case across in exactly a few seconds. I think it's about like 20 seconds when you read the letters of correspondence. And helped with his translators, whom he's come with to Britain, he puts his case across in 20 seconds. She's moved, so is Prince Albert. Immediately, Albert invites Mir Jafar Ali Khan to another social event, which is the celebrations of the 57th anniversary celebrations of the Royal Society of Arts. There, in a rather unprecedented move, Albert introduces Mir Jafar Ali Khan to two stalwart political bigwigs. On the left is Sir Richard Bethell, who would go on to become Solicitor General to Queen Victoria, and on the right is Sir Fitzroy Kelly, who had already held the position of Solicitor General to Queen Victoria. Now, with these really strong guns who give Mir Jafar Ali Khan a patient hearing and who once again think that the injustice is absolutely flagrant and he should stay back in England and fight, there is a certain sense of buoyancy in the Indian camp. They believe that if they stay and if they fight, there is a chance, backed by Victoria and Albert, to expose the malpractices of the English East India Company. But, money is running out, and he can't necessarily stay on. So Unfortunately, in October 1844, Mir Jafar Ali Khan has to pack his bags and return to India. It's a rather, it basically kind of takes the winds out of his sails because it's so close but no cigar. When he returns to India, the English East India Company wreak havoc. They block all roads of justice to the Indian in the courts of law. They pass a special act in Bombay. It's called the Special Act of Bombay 1848, whereby Mir Jafar Ali Khan cannot prosecute the English East India Company in the courts in India, which basically means their judgment on the estates is final. They even go to the extent of calling for a public auction of the estates, which means his daughters would inherit nothing. There would be complete catastrophic unemployment within the estates, all to make a quick buck. So for the next 9 years, Mir Jafar Ali Khan is left with no option but to fling himself into rural India. He spends the next 9 years roaming the countryside of Kathiawar, which was his paternal principality, pumping in money from Kamandia to keep the estates in Surat alive. Debts are rising. He flings himself into Sufi shrines, immerses himself in spirituality, and becomes this kind of wandering dervish / prince who's left with no other option but to mortgage everything that he has in his paternal principality and return to England. Finally, in 1853, he decides to return to England. But once again, he's plagued by this rather ridiculous issue of not having a son. And the English East India Company now go for his paternal state, which is Kamandia, and mark it for annexation. With no choice left, as I said, he mortgages everything that he has personally and lands up in England. And he seeks his final showdown with the East India Company in 1853. Now, in 1853, the two allies that he had befriended earlier have still been in correspondence with him while he's been in India for the last 9 years, and they welcome him back. He parks himself in a relatively interesting place called 15 Warwick Avenue, and both his lawyers advise him that it would not be advisable to approach the British courts of law, but to challenge the East India Company in the Houses of Parliament. Now, this is something that's so important to understand because it would be the first time that an Indian would challenge the East India Company in their own parliament. And the East India Company at this time are representatives of empire. They are the canon of empire expansion. But in order to get into parliament, he needs an approval from the Judicial Committee, and that would take another 6 to 8 months. Now, in this time of 6 to 8 months, something rather interesting happens that brings a certain sense of cheer to his life. Sir Fitzroy Kelly takes him to the Royal Astley Theatre. And the Royal Astley Theatre is where most of the movers and shakers of Britain land up going for entertainment. And this particular evening is a celebration of the victory at Waterloo, and there's an ode being sung to the fallen at Waterloo. The lady who's singing the ode to the fallen at Waterloo is a lady called Mary Jane Flood. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and almost instantly, the Indian prince falls in love with her. He asks her out, and they start going out. They actually start dating. The press, once again, is all over this cross-pollinated couple. Romance flourishes in Lord Byron's Maida Vale, which is where he lives. The Times can't get enough of this Indian-English couple, and they write innumerable amounts of columns on them. He hires a light blue carriage, attends operas again, and once again, the glamour-seeking English public is satiated by all that's coming out in the press. Nevertheless, he doesn't lose focus on what is of paramount importance, which is the fight for a third of Surat. Finally, the Judicial Committee in Britain comes back with a ruling which clearly states that it was tyranny on the part of the English East India Company and Mir Jafar Ali Khan's case is permitted to be admitted in Parliament. In his own words, Mir Jafar Ali Khan would call this the final frontier. This would be the place where he would fight for the rights of his daughters and for his own survival. No Indian prince, no Indian had walked into British Parliament to challenge the might of empire in 1856. So I'd really like you to picture this. It's 1856, empire is at its peak. And an Indian with special consent would walk into the Houses of Parliament to expose the machinations of their empire. Now, to get around this, there would have to be incredibly intense study of the treaty, as well as a very thought out and a very well articulated narrative, which would have to be fought in a heated debate so that this bill could pass. And why is that? And that is because the East India Company began to panic. And it's important to pause here for a second and understand the stakeholders in the East India Company. They were lords, dukes, earls, barons. I mean, you know, the top cream of British society were invested in the English East India Company. And so when they realized that Sir Richard Bethell and Sir Fitzroy Kelly, along with Mir Jafar Ali Khan, are going to enter in British Parliament to table a bill to get the restored estates back and the income back, it meant their malpractices would be exposed. And so they appoint two men who would be given the task of fighting Mir Jafar Ali Khan's bill in Parliament and ensuring that it is defeated. These two gentlemen are none other than Robert Vernon Smith, who is the president of the East India Company and the Board of Control, and Sir James Weir Hogg, who is also an MP from Honiton and a director in the company. Now, both of these men would do anything in their power to ensure that the bill is defeated. Delaying tactics, ensuring that the bill is not read, trying everything to promote the fact that Indians should not be allowed in Britain to come and fight their cases, otherwise it would set out a norm of sorts. Anything that was possible to defeat the bill would be something that these gentlemen would use. The Speaker allows for 5 hearings of the bill. Now, if the bill does not pass in 5 hearings, it means the bill has been defeated. On the 5th of June, Mir Jafar Ali Khan enters Parliament with his 2 lawyers. The MPs are rather stunned to see a man entering in a sherwani and a turban, but not just with the objective of watching proceedings, but with the objective of defeating the East India Company in their own Parliament. However, just as Sir Fitzroy Kelly is about to rise and speak, the Speaker shuts him down and doesn't allow the hearing to happen. Gives another date, which is the 11th of June. On the 11th of June, Sir Fitzroy Kelly again tries to stand up and speak and is shut down. Finally, he gets his opportunity of a minute to make a speech, and he delivers probably the most passionate speech of his life, where he calls for the end of British rule in India. Mir Jafar Ali Khan is there, and it is the first and only documented piece of evidence, if I'm correct, where a call to an end of British rule is given in the House of Commons on the behalf of an Indian through his British lawyers. But yet, the Speaker refuses to call for a vote. By this time, there's a certain sense that the tide is rising in favor of the Indian, because MP after MP starts to rise and speaks in favor of Mir Jafar Ali Khan. Once again, the bill is not taken to vote. And another date is given, which is the 18th of June. On the 18th of June, Sir Fitzroy Kelly and Sir Erskine Perry threaten the East India Company with direct crown intervention, which basically means the Queen would step in on behalf of the Indian if the bill is not taken to vote. Once again, the Speaker refuses to take the bill to vote. Finally, a final date is given, which is the 23rd of June. It's a full House of 241 MPs, and if the bill doesn't pass on this date, it would not be entered in the House of Lords, where it would have to be heard again. At precisely 2:30 p.m., Sir Richard Bethell, who's the Solicitor General to the Queen, gets up and makes, in his opinion, once again, the most passionate speech of his life, fighting on behalf of Mir Jafar Ali Khan. With literally half an hour to go for the session to end, the Speaker is pushed to take the bill to vote. And what happens next, in my opinion, is quite an iconic day in British Indian history. Because I haven't encountered in my research that something quite like this happened, where out of a House of 241 MPs, 213 voted in favor of an Indian against 18 noes. And his bill passed with a thumping majority. The only time that an Indian got a bill passed in the Houses of Parliament. So that is the story of Surat, fall of a port, rise of a prince. What happens to Mary Jane Flood, his girlfriend, and to Mir Jafar Ali Khan, and whether they come back to India and live a life under the warm Indian sun, that's for you to find out by buying the book and reading it. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. Sorry, yes, he's my great-great-great-grandfather. Thank you. Mohammed.
Hi, Moin. I'm Muhammad Wajiuddin from Times of India. It's quite fascinating to hear this story, which you certainly did hard work by scouring British libraries and reading so many papers and documents and all that. But can you tell us that now that you have already revealed that you come from the family, I knew that, but what actually brought you here? I mean, you know, I remember that you were here in different professions, you went to New Zealand. So are you also kind of retracing your ancestors' steps, and then you have brought your British wife here? So, you know, what makes you go to all this and bring out this story?
Thank you, Mohammed. As I mentioned at the beginning, there were two primary reasons why I wrote this book. The first is, as I said, you know, a lot is known about how the English East India Company annexed Awadh, how they took over Delhi, you know, how Richard Wellesley defeated Tipu Sultan, but not much is known about Surat. You know, people know about how Punjab was annexed, people know about the story of Duleep Singh, but no one knows about how Surat fell to the English East India Company. So that was the first reason. And the second reason was this absolutely compelling story of an Indian who lands up in Victorian England to challenge the machinations of empire. You know, there are innumerable accounts of how Indians went there. Some of them were banished, some not banished, but some of them were, I mean, Duleep Singh, it was a tragic life. You know, he was virtually banished there. Some of them went just to enjoy the sights and sounds. You know, we read about Maharajas who just go there to enjoy sights and sounds and come back and write theses about their lives. But this was a man who had many underlying narratives to an overarching cause. And the overarching cause was, of course, to win back what was rightfully his and his daughters. But there were so many underlying narratives. Here was a man who was finding his feet as a 26-year-old in Victorian England. Here was a man who was vulnerable. Although he was married, he falls in love with an English actress. Here was a man who was unwavering in his cause, in what he wanted. And also someone who called for the end of British rule in the Houses of Parliament, which I had never come across. I know someone came close. For example, when Satara was annexed, they sent an agent there, and he desperately tried to get a bill tabled in the House of Commons, but he failed. But the success of Mir Jafar Ali Khan in exposing the malpractices of the East India Company in the Houses of Parliament, was compelling enough for me to write the book. Sorry.
So, okay. Ma'am, could you please pass?
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Just, you were talking about the 1856 when he probably returned, and this whole thing happened. And then we have 1857. So after 1857, there was end of the East India Company, and
That's
then
right.
the direct rule.
That's
so it's
right.
a quite important, phase.
That's
that
right.
phase seems to be quite important.
That's right. In fact, it is the defeat of the company in the House of Commons, along with the mutiny, the bloody mutiny that happens in 1857, that spells the death knell for the company.
Hi, Moin. I've just got your book today, and it's been great to read. Reading through the early chapters, you've spoken about the cosmopolitan nature of Surat, but I couldn't help but notice that you've sort of skipped over one of the most interesting stories that connects Surat with the East India Company, which is the death of Thomas Coriat.
Yes.
And there's no mention of his discussions with Thomas Roe, who set up the East India factory in Surat, and how his grave is still this sort of big mystery.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to exist somewhere in and around Surat.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very valid point. Thomas Roe did declare Surat to be the fountain of all East India trade. And it was, because of his championing the cause of basically trade in that region, that the English East India Company were able to kind of nudge out the Dutch and the Portuguese.
No, but I'm talking about Tom Coriat,
Yeah.
who was the sort of court jester in England. And then he came to Surat.
Yes.
He traveled all over India, and one of the first travel writers in English about India. And he's supposed to have died in Surat, and there is no mention of his grave or what has happened to him after that. So it's this big mystery, which you've kind of just
That's
skipped.
true, but I would urge you to go to the cemeteries. You might find his grave there.
Okay, we'll take about 2 more questions.
I think there's a
Lady. Sorry, could I just give it to her first? Thank you.
Sorry.
Hi.
Hi.
I wanted to ask you, why do you think this story has not been picked up before? Does it have something to do with the narrative that has been fed to the Indians? Because from what you tell me, it's a very interesting story. It has never been happened before. And it's mind-blowing what has been done. Why is it that we are just hearing about it now? Why has this topic been picked up so many years later?
I'm absolutely delighted that you asked this question, and even more delighted that it comes from someone as young as you. I speak at various places in England, but in India, it's so good to see the young engaging with history and literature and asking these interesting questions. Why has this story not been told before? Probably it was waiting for me to tell the story. But, no, on a lighter note, I think the English were brilliant at constructing narratives that suited them. Yeah, and so for them, the minute Surat lost relevance as a port and Bombay took over, it lost relevance. It only found itself in the Bombay Gazetteer, as a port that once existed. As far as Mir Jafar Ali Khan's personal life is concerned, in Britain, as well as his cause, it's documented in every official government gazette in Britain, as well as in the British Library. You can find tons of information on him. But as I said, his legacy faded with time, and it was about time that it got its due.
Thank you, sir. So, coming to a question to you, haven't there been many men who have persisted with the whatever struggles they have gone through? Question to you, what eventually, thank you for all your vivid descriptions and a wonderful book which you have come through. It's what made him win and his solo battle to made the East Indian Company juxtaposed and absolutely defeated? What made him persist with his unwavering focus and attention to, in spite he could have been bribed or given some empire there, but 9 years of being a vagabond and so many allegations he must have gone through, absolutely wasting period. What was his battle? There have been many world leaders, there have been many men who have fought the battle. Men are supposed to be like that. But this was a truly a wonderful prince and a courageous man, a courageous king and a prince.
Thank you. I think, when you read the letters, when I read the letters, when I read the correspondence, I spent close to 3.5 years, 4 years researching this book in the British Library. And when you read the letters, you sense various different moments in his life, which to anyone who is sensitive enough to the mood would be able to pick up. So there are letters where there is, where one can sense a certain sense of real vulnerability, because he's fighting not just for himself, he's fighting for his daughters. And there's a sensitivity to that shines in his letters. It's about his infant daughters who've been disinherited, who've been flung into this little hole where they have to live their lives. And you sense that in his letters. In other letters, you sense a certain sense of resoluteness of will, where he's just, where it is about going that extra yard and not just championing the cause of his girls, but also about exposing the company in Britain and bringing to an end the corporation's colonizing enterprise in India. And so there are various things that have driven him. Of course, the cause of himself, his girls, the fact that the company needs to be exposed and brought to an end. And I think that's enough to keep a good man going.
Yeah. My name is Dr. Mukund. I read your book. My name is Dr. Mukund. Here.
Sorry.
Here.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It was a fantastic story. I really appreciate it. Only thing I would like to know, how long has it taken for you to actually do the whole research and write your book?
Sorry,
Time frame it has taken for you to do the whole research.
Right.
Because you said it is your great-grandfather or your great-great-grandfather. I don't know how. How long has it taken you to get the whole stuff into a book?
Well, cumulatively, I would say close to about 5 years, because there were documents that are in what we call the family archives, which are in the most pathetic state, but that's how it started. But actually, it started with my grandfather, who gave me the original minutes of the debates in the House of Commons in 1857. And he gave me that original book, which is in, it's so brittle that if you turn a page, you can hear it rustle and tear. And he gave that to me at the age of 15, and I didn't read it then, but I read it, later on. So it started with that, which was the original minuted debates. And then, of course, research at the British Library, research in the libraries here, but most importantly, research in Surat, which is the heart of the story. And so it took me close to 5 years to get it out.
Okay, so we'll take one last question, please.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, sir behind you had already asked. Sorry.
Thank you. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
I wanted to just ask something very odd. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
I said, maybe my question's a little odd.
No, go ahead.
But you said that the Nawab you're speaking about, he had 2 daughters, right?
Yeah.
But the line has been carried on through the 2 daughters. So who did they marry and how did that come about?
Yes. So what was the last question? How did what come about?
Well, what I'm saying is normally a male heir carries on the line, right?
Yeah.
But in this case, 2 women carried on
That's
the line.
right.
So who did they marry and how did that line continue?
So so let's address the issue of the title first.
Okay.
And I think it's important to address that because it all stems from there. Nawab Afzaluddin was the last Nawab of Surat. There is no doubt in that. and the treaty and the title has been made extinct. So unlike, let's say, the Prince of Arcot, who is officially recognized by the Constitution of India as a prince, there is no Nawab of Surat. It's very similar to Nawab of Awadh. There is no Nawab of Awadh. Wajid Ali Shah was the last Nawab of Awadh. So Nawab Afzaluddin was the last Nawab of Surat. He had one daughter who married Mir Jafar Ali Khan, and he had two daughters. The older daughter was Ladli Begum, who married the Nawab of Bela, and that is the senior line. So that's the older daughter's line. Then you have the younger daughter, Rahimunisa. She married the Qazi of Surat, and that line is also there. Jafar Ali Khan, well, I'm not going to reveal the end because there's also a son that comes in, which you'll find out when you read the book. Where he comes from, you'll find out. But the two daughters, yes. The two daughters is the senior branch of Ladli Begum, who married the Nawab of Bela, and that line is the senior branch. And then the younger daughter married the Qazi of Surat, and that's the junior branch, if you wish.
We take the final question for this session. Please, thank you.
Sir, if you said that that was the bill which was very important for India, the first bill, so why isn't this story, it is important, so why isn't this story included in the history textbooks in the school?
I wonder why. I wonder why too. But it's important to understand that while the bill passes in the House of Commons, and there's no doubt about that, it's an incredible victory, 213 to 18. The narrative, and I keep coming back to this, the narrative that the English wrote was only to suit themselves. It was not to suit the Indians. That was one reason why it's not known. And secondly, you know, I don't want to give too much away of the book, but he dies very young. He dies at a very young age, and so his legacy just automatically faded away. If there had been someone who had taken his legacy forward, it would have probably been, you know, a rather well-known fact. But as soon as he wins in Britain, on his return to India, unfortunately, it's not too long alive.